Let's start off with this topic that says practical, ethical, and theoretical influences on sociological research. We're talking about the different factors that could possibly have an impact on a sociological research. There are three different factors that we'd be taking into account over here. We'd start off with practical factors, we'd move on to discuss ethical factors, and we'd conclude this with theoretical factors. Now, as we speak about the different factors that affect a sociological research or that influence a sociological research, like I said, to begin with, we'd initially discuss practical factors. As we speak about practical factors, there are, uh, if I may list them down, the first factor that we'd be taking into account over here is the access a researcher has and the availability of data from participants, right? Having access to the participants is pretty important. What if we're talking about a situation where the researcher does not have access to the group of individuals or to an individual that the experiment or that the researcher wants to conduct a research on? Now, that could end up being a problem. Number one, that could end up being a practical problem that would be seen as a practical problem. Number two, interest of the researcher. The interest of the researcher or the topic that a researcher takes interest in is again seen as something that could influence or that could impact your research process, your research findings, and eventually conclusions. Number three, funding. Number four, we'd speak about the time available to the researcher. Number five, the topic and research questions. Number six, the people who are being studied. They also influence the research process, the findings, and the conclusions. And eventually, towards the end, we'd speak about the characteristics of the researcher. Now, these are the different factors that we would be discussing while talking about the practical factors that affect a research. Number two, if we speak about ethical factors or ethical influences, we'd speak about consent, or also referred to as informed consent. Number two, we'd speak about the right that participants have to withdraw from the research. Number three, we'd speak about how a researcher should ensure that the participants are not physically or psychologically harmed. Number four, we need to see that the participants are not deceived. Number five, we need to see that the researcher needs to see or ensure that the participants' privacy is not invaded. Number six, the participants should have the security of their names or their identity not being disclosed or published. Number seven, we speak about how, if deceived, the participants should be debriefed towards the end. Or in other words, once the research gets over, the participants should be told that they were being deceived. They should be told that they were a part of a research, or they should be told if there was anything that they were not aware of while they were a part of this research. Towards the end, the third factor that we would be taking into account over here has to do with theoretical influences. If you're a Marxist, how is it that it's going to affect your research, the topic you choose to conduct a research, the research process, and the research findings? You being a feminist, likewise, you being a functionist, yeah, likewise, right? Now, moving on, we would also talk about how you being a positivist or interpretivist affects your research process, your research findings, and eventually conclusion. So, without any further ado, let's begin with this topic. Now, this particular topic, you could have shorter questions on this, but at the same time, even when this has not been a very popular topic, there's always a possibility that you might end up getting a 26-mark question on this. Now, if I may write, you could get a question that says, evaluate the view that practical factors are the most significant influences or influence on a sociological research. A 26-mark evaluative essay question. Of course, if you're getting this particular question in the support side of the argument, you would be expected to write down about how practical factors have the most have an impact, and you'd try to show how this is the most significant factor. And at the same time, as you'd write down about, so in support and against, so it would turn out to be something like this. What if the practical factors were that I just spoke about? And as a counter argument, or uh, as an antithesis, the flip side of the coin, you can write down about how ethical factors have their role to play, how theoretical factors have to have their role to play. Likewise, if you get a question that says, evaluate the view that theoretical factors are the most significant influence on the sociological research. So for the support side, you'd write down about theoretical factors, and the against side, you'd be expected to write down about the practical factors and ethical factors. So taking this a little further from here, if I may start off with practical factors here. As we speak about practical factors, like I just said, initially, we'd speak about the access and availability of data. Access to and availability of data. Now, as we speak about having access to the participants, if you're conducting a research, as a researcher, it is expected of you to choose a topic, to choose a research topic where you have chances of being able to generate data, right? There are certain instances where, as a researcher, you find it very challenging to be able to get hold of the people that you want to conduct a research on, and which eventually means you being able to generate data might end up being pretty problematic. So having ease of access to people and research site varies, right? For instance, if you want to conduct a research, if I may give you an example here, if you want to conduct a research at a public place, right? If you want to conduct a research at a public place, could be a street, could be a shopping mall, could be a club, versus you having to conduct a research at sites such as, let's just say, hospitals, right? A hospital, if you speak about a hospital, or for the matter of fact, if you speak about a prison, if you speak about a school, right? Now, if I may give you an example over here, let me just exemplify this. So if you wanting to conduct a research in a street, if you want to collect data from a shopping mall, versus you having to collect data from a school or a hospital, this would, of course, be different. And if you're wanting to conduct a research on any school or a hospital, you'd have to seek permission from a gatekeeper. Now, who is a gatekeeper over here? As we use the word gatekeeper, we're actually referring to the person or a group in a particular setting, could be a school, like I said, could be a hospital, could be a prison, who is responsible for, or who has the authority to allow or to not allow a researcher to undertake research, right? So there has to be someone, for instance, if you speak about a school, at a school, it would be the principal, right? The person, the authoritative figure who has the authority to either allow or to not allow the researcher to collect data. So this has to be kept in mind. So there are certain situations, there are certain sites where access might be denied to you because you'd have to seek permission from the gatekeeper, right? Do not forget this word gatekeeper over here, right? Now, one. Number two, if we talk about another factor, we could speak about interests of the researcher. Now, as I speak about the interests of the researcher, at times a researcher chooses a topic because it is a reflection, or because the researcher is interested in that particular topic, right? Now, for example, if there's a researcher who has interest in crime, in criminal gangs, right? In deviant behavior that might lead to that particular researcher wanting to get hold of individuals from a particular criminal gang. On the contrary, if there's a researcher who has interest in how the education system in a particular society operates, right? So the interest a researcher has in a particular topic does of course affect the does of course affect uh, the research, and is of course a practical factor that we cannot be ignoring. Number three, we could speak about funding. As we speak about funding over here, funding plays a very crucial role when it comes to conducting a research as well. Now, let's just say, as a researcher, you want to conduct a research on a particular topic, but the funding body does not allow you to, or the funding body is not ready to make an investment in that particular subject area that you want to conduct a research on. And in this case, you also need to keep in mind that there are certain research topics on which, if you as a researcher, you want to conduct a research on, they might end up being more costly, where you could possibly experience funding issues, right? Now, there are certain charitable foundations, there are certain government organizations, there are certain business organizations. They do uh, grant funds for research, but then again, when a particular organization is granting funds for a particular research, they would have their own priorities. Now, let's just say funding is usually done through, we could write, charitable foundations, through the government, different universities, different business organizations, etc., etc. Right? So, when you are, as a researcher, wanting to conduct a research, you need to keep in mind that the priorities of the funding agency, the priorities of the funding agency or funding body may end up affecting the research topic that you want to conduct a research on, the choice of methods that the research that the funding agency might want you to be using as a researcher to be able to collect data, so on and so forth. So the priorities might change in terms of, let's just say, the choice of topic. This might change in terms of the choice of data collection method. Now, of course, if you talk about self-completion questionnaires, they aren't very costly if you compare them with participant observations or longitudinal researches. They are more costly. So, as a researcher, you would want to pick up a method that fits in, or you would want to pick up a method that is in line with the budget that you have from the funding agency. Number four, another factor that we might want to discuss over here is time. Time plays a very important role when it comes to conducting researches. Like I'd said, there are certain researches that are more expensive. Likewise, there are certain researches that might be more demanding in terms of time. Having to conduct a research through an interview, I'll just give you an example over here. Having to conduct a research through an interview, or for the matter of fact, having to conduct a research by getting questionnaires filled, compared to having to conduct a research through participant observations, right? Or case studies, they take more of time. Do we understand this? I hope you all do. Moving on to the fifth point that we could discuss over here is the topic and research question. Your topic and research questions also play a very important role here. Now, there are certain topics that are more suitable when it comes to conducting a research through research questions, or where it comes to conducting a research where you could gather qualitative data. For example, if a researcher is trying to study the experience of becoming a parent. Now, this is a research uh, that would demand using qualitative methods such as unstructured interviews, qualitative methods such as maybe focus group, right? Focus group interviews, so on and so forth. So the particular topic you are conducting a research on suggests, or the particular topic that you have chosen to conduct a research on, of course, affects the type of data that you as a researcher would want to collect. Now, the example that I gave you of being of the researcher wanting to conduct a research on the experience of becoming a parent, you would not want to use quantitative data because this is a topic where you would want to capture the participants' subjective experiences. You would want to give meaning to those subjective experiences. And for you to be able to collect such data, it is always better for you to collect data through qualitative data techniques and not otherwise. Next, we could speak about the people being studied. If we talk about the people being studied, now, of course, there are some groups that are secretive. There are certain new religious movements, or let's refer to them better as cults. If you talk about wanting to conduct a research on Scientology, the Church of Scientology, let's just say New York, there are people who are very secretive about their activities, and they wouldn't really want an outsider to walk in and collect data on them. So, if you talk about the people being studied, some methods are less suitable than others for studying certain groups. Now, if you talk about self completion questionnaires, they are, even when they're convenient and even when they save you a lot of time, even when they're cost effective, but at the same time we also need to keep in mind that for you to be able to conduct a research through a questionnaire, you would expect, or you would want, the participants from whom you're trying to collect data to be literate, right? Now, likewise, if you talk about asking teenage gang members to participate in interviews or complete questionnaires, is unlikely because they might not have any interest in helping out or facilitating the researcher. So in that case, joining in their activities, or maybe conducting a research through participant observation, might be a better option for you as a researcher. Taking this ahead, another factor that we should keep in mind is characteristics of the researcher. And as I speak about the characteristics of the researcher, we could talk about the researcher's social class, the researcher's gender, his or her ethnicity, his or her age, region, nationality, all of these factors and a lot more do affect or have an impact on the research that you're trying to conduct. And the point that I'm trying to make over here is all of these factors, they are examples of, they're actually practical factors. Now, taking this ahead, if we move on and we speak about ethical influences. As we speak about ethical influences over here, so as we speak about ethical influences over here, today, as we speak, as we are almost through with the first quarter of the 21st century, there are many professional bodies, there are many funding bodies that have their own ethical guidelines, and they ensure that they're funding a research when they're confident that the research organization or the researcher would be abiding by the ethical guidelines. Now, when we talk about ethical guidelines, these are the do's and don'ts that the sociologist or the sociological research worker is expected to be keeping in mind while conducting a research. Now, for example, people having to be aware if you want to conduct a research on them. Now, that we refer to as consent, right? So, if you're a researcher, you're expected to take informed consent from the participants. Or, in other words, participants must fully understand the research and agree to take part in it voluntarily. I think I just write these down. Number one, informed consent. Informed consent when, in other words, the participants must fully understand the research and agree to take part in it voluntarily. Now, one. Number two, we could say right to withdrawal. So, see, many participants, when they participate in a research, in many cases, they aren't aware that as a research participants, they have an option of letting go of the research or not participating in the research anymore at any given point that they would want. So, as we speak about right to withdrawal, this is participants being aware or them being informed that that they always have an option of withdrawing from the research at any given point without any negative consequences. Likewise, a third factor that we could keep in mind over here that the researcher should be keeping in mind is avoiding incurring harm to the participants. Now, this harm may be physical harm and psychological harm too. So, as a researcher, you should ensure that the participants are not physically nor emotionally or socially harmed during the study. A researcher should ensure that the participants are not physically, psychologically, or emotionally or socially harmed during the study. Another factor that we could bring in under consideration over here could be confidentiality and privacy. Now, as we speak about confidentiality and privacy, when I use the word confidentiality, the idea is that the identity of the participants, the identity of the research participants should not be disclosed, should not be published by the researcher, because not every research participant would want to uh, show their affiliation with a particular research publicly. And again, we also need to keep in mind that not every research has a very favorable outcome. Not every research has an outcome that the people who've participated in that research would want to openly, openly openly disclose their participation in that research. And at the same time, privacy, invasion of privacy is wrong. You want to observe participants, you might as well observe them at a public place and refrain from observing them at places where they would expect to have their own personal space. Likewise, if you want to collect data through a questionnaire, make sure you don't have any question in the questionnaire that is uh, that hurts someone, or that might seem like an invasion of privacy by the participant. So we could write that personal information or the identity of the participant must remain confidential. And the participant's identity must be kept protected. And at the same time, like I said, the researchers should ensure that there is no invasion of privacy for the participants. Number five, a researcher should try to the best of his or her capacity to avoid deception. Do not deceive your participants. Do not deceive them about the nature of the research. Do not deceive them about the procedure of the research. Do not deceive them about anything that they should know before they decide to participate in a particular study. So the researchers should avoid misleading participants, avoid misleading participants, unless the researcher fears demand characteristics and wants to yeah and wants to improve the credibility of the study. But then again, what's wrong is wrong. If you're deceiving one, you should avoid not deceiving. If you are deceiving, there's a way. Towards the end, the researcher is expected to debrief the participants. And when I use the word debriefing, the idea over here is letting the participants know that they were being misled, that they were being deceived. One. Number two, to apologize from them. Number three, to ensure that they're leaving the research premises in the right state of mind, that is, they're not psychologically harmed or disturbed. And at the same time, the last thing, which I believe also should be a part of debriefing process, is the participants being given an option. If a participant still, after being after the researcher has even apologized, if the participant still wants to get his or her data removed, the researcher is expected to do this. So avoid using or avoid misleading participants unless necessary. And if misled, the participants should be debriefed afterwards. Another point that the researchers should keep in mind is about how marginal groups, powerless groups, vulnerable groups should be taken care of more. So we could say extra care must be taken when researching children, elderly people, women, or marginalized groups, disabled people, as they may be more susceptible to harm or more prone to harm, or they have more chances of being harmed. So these are a couple of ethical guidelines that a researcher is expected to take to keep in mind when he or she is conducting a research. So with that, number one, we spoke about ethical factors, the ethical factors that are expected from a researcher to be taken care of when he or she is conducting sorry, the practical factors. I'm sorry, we initially had spoken about the practical factors that the researcher should be keeping in mind while he or she is conducting a research. And along with practical factors, number one, number two, we spoke about ethical factors or ethical influences. Now, moving on, the third factor that we should be aware of that might influence the research, the research process primarily is theoretical influences or theoretical factors. I think I've been writing factors here. Influences. So the first I've written factors. I just write down ethical factors over here as well. It's the same thing, either or. Number three, I just write down theoretical factors too. Now, as we speak about theoretical factors, a sociologist's theoretical position, or a sociologist being a Marxist, a functionist, a feminist, an interactionist, a postmodernist, this does or this increases the chances of the sociologist's research being influenced. For example, if you talk about a Marxist might see the social class system as the foundation of capitalist society, and as a result, as a consequence, the Marxist researcher might tend to focus on topics such so they might end up focusing on topics that are more to do with class inequality, that are more to do with class conflict, that are more to do with class identity. And so is the case with feminists, so is the case with functionists, so is the case with postmodernists. So the school of thought that you belong to might end up affecting your research. Now, over here, if I may use an example over here, and we talk about the difference between positivism and interpretivism, we could say we're all aware of this, but I just put it over here so that you all can use this as a revision too. So positivists prefer quantitative data, quantitative data or methods, and quantitative methods. For example, we could speak about the usage of surveys for data collection to be able to produce objective data. And this objective data is expected to be more generalizable too. Why generalizable? Because of course, quantitative, when you're conducting a research through quantitative data, there are more chances of you being able to get hold of a lot of data. And when data collection process is easier, you would want to collect data from as many people as possible so that the findings of your research are more generalizable. And on the other hand, in contrary, if we speak about interpretivists, favor qualitative methods. For example, unstructured interviews, to be able to explore subjective experiences of individuals. Another factor that we can bring in under discussion is how validity, reliability, and representativeness can affect your research process and findings. We could say researchers consider whether whether a particular method produces accurate data, that is valid data. We often use the word validity for accuracy, consistent data, which we also refer to as reliable data, and representative data, that is data that represents the target population. The sample that you've chosen represents the target population, so that the findings might be applicable better. Representative data that reflects the wider population. In other words, so that the findings of that research are more useful or applicable to the masses. Number four, we could speak about the focus of the research, as I was giving you an example of Marxism a couple of minutes ago. We could say sociologists are influenced by their theoretical approach or the school of thought that they belong to. Approach. For example, I'll just write it down so that it is easier for you to understand and revise, use this uh, as a revision. For example, if we speak about Marxists who study inequality, or we could speak about feminists studying gender. They'd choose the methods, they would choose the data collection methods that align with their focus, or let's make it easier, with their perspective, or are in line with their perspective or the theory that they believe in. So these were a couple of theoretical factors, ethical factors, and at the same time, we had also spoken about practical factors as to how these factors affect a research, a sociological research. Now, taking this a little further, there are a couple of questions that I would want you all to have a look at. Or before that, if anyone wants to pause this and read, this would help you. This could be additional piece of information for you as well. This one, as well as this one. There are certain references of researchers that you might want to put to use as well. Now, taking this a little further, if you have a look at this question, In November 2022, you had a question. There was an 8-mark question in variant A, and the question read, explain 2 practical factors that may influence a sociologist's choice of research topic. See, so this is an 8-mark question. You know how you score an 8 on 8 on a question of this sort. You get the first mark for making a point or giving a practical factor. You get the second mark for explaining that particular practical factor. You get the third mark for selecting some sociological material related to it. And you get the fourth mark for explaining how that particular method material supports the point. So this is an answer that you might want to uh, pause and read. Likewise, this is another question that you have on this same topic that you had in March 2022, variant 1, 2. And the question over here reads, explain 2 ways that research might be affected by how it is funded. So funding is again an example of practical factor. This is a typical 8-mark question. You might as well want to pause this, and I'd suggest you should attempt this question as well. Taking it ahead, this could be one of the, this is not a model answer. This is just showing you how you could write an answer too. So this is an answer to that question. So these were the questions that I was talking about. In May, June 2015, you had a question that read, evaluate the view that practical factors are more important than theoretical factors in influencing the choice of research method in sociology. So I've just rephrased this question according to the current paper structure and the way the examiner phrases questions now. And again, there was another question in the same year in variant C. The question read, evaluate the view that the most important influence on a sociologist's choice of research method is their theoretical perspective. So this particular topic, I hope, has been understood. This is not a difficult topic. It is super simple. And on your screen right now, you see a summary of what of a part of what we just today. I hope this was helpful.